Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to Escambia Citizens Watch Live. I'm John Singley, your host today, and we are continuing our series of looking in detail at the mayor's transition report. I think many of us were happy to see Mayor Robinson embarking on such a progressive step as actually doing a transition team report. And many of you had the opportunity to watch as the team gave its report and have looked at pieces of it online. But today we're going to look at the environmental section of the report with our guest, Christian Wagley. Christian is one of our friends here in Pensacola, a friend of many of us here. He's lived here quite some time. Christian is currently the coastal organizer for the nonprofit group Healthy Gulf, and their mission is to ensure that the waters of the Gulf and the contributing waterways are following the law, doing the best they can, and making life better for the natural world as well as the human world. So, Christian, thank you for coming in today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here, John.
I'm always interested in what Christian has to say, and so are a lot of people around town, and we're live this afternoon, so if you have any questions for Christian or any comments you'd like for him to talk about, or the transition team in his wheelhouse, which is the environment, please make a comment on your Facebook page, and we'll see them, and we'll pass them right along to Christian. So on that note, sir, I'll give us just the elevator speech, as we like to say, on your background, Christian, for those of you who don't know you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I grew up in Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay and was, loved to work on environmental issues as a kid, loved to fish on the Chesapeake Bay, got interested in those issues there, and then came to Pensacola to go to graduate school at the University of West Florida, got a master's degree in it's biology and coastal zone studies, so kind of environmental issues related to the coastal areas, and for the last 20 plus years worked in on different environmental issues in state and local government, in the private sector, and now in the nonprofit world as well.
So you were named by Mayor Robinson to be a member of the team. Share with us, if you can, how did this come about? Did you and Mayor Robinson know each other, or you were recommended? How did you manage to wind up on the team?
Yeah, I've had a great relationship with Mayor Robinson through the years. As a county commissioner, he helped me a lot with a lot of issues I worked on related to, let's say, keeping oil and gas drilling away from the coast of Florida, and other issues. Restore Act, which was the BP money that came after the oil spill. So, and I had respect for him, especially during the oil spill. He had not really been involved in environmental issues as a commissioner, and he rose to the occasion. He learned what was going on and really dove into that and really rose to the occasion, and I respected him a lot for that. So we had a friendly relationship. We worked on some of those issues through the years, and riding my bicycle along one day, probably 10 days before he was due to take office, and the phone rang, and I pulled over, and it was him, and he invited me to join the transition team, and I was excited. Of course, I said yes, and just an honor to serve with Quint Studer, with Mayor Robinson, and just the quality of the other people on that team was really tremendous.
So in reading the transition report that you prepared, as well as the appendices in there, you define the environment in a little bit broader way than I think many of us do, at least I do, and I want to talk about that for a minute. In your scope review, you say that the environment includes not only the air and the land and the sea, but the natural and the human health as well. It's the human health part that caught my attention. Tell me how that is linked to the traditional view of environmental stewardship.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we learn more about this connection between human health and environmental health, we learn how inextricably linked they are. I mean, when you just think about it at the most basic level, human beings and the plants and animals around us, we really utilize the same sources of water and the same sources of air together, and so it's in our best interest that those sources be clean. And as we get more sophisticated with our scientific research, we've learned more and more about that connection in terms of human health and the things that affect the lives of human beings. And humans are part of the environment. We shape it a lot of times in very negative ways. We have the ability to shape it in positive ways, and we just have this inextricable link, and we've got to recognize that.
In your report, the first observation I noticed, and you told me before we started today that these weren't necessarily in priority order. It's just the way you basically wrote them down. You brought up something again, sort of out of the box thinking, that you believe that the local transportation system is likely one of the greatest sources of negative impacts to the environment. I thought that was pretty out of the box thinking. Talk to us about the link between the transportation system here locally and the effects upon the natural health and the human health.
Sure, and when I say transportation system, I'm talking about the entire system. I'm not talking about specifically the ECAT bus service. I'm talking about all of it. How we get around, how we move people around this community every day. And the reality is that the biggest part of the way we move around is we move around by ourselves in automobiles, and the environmental impact of that is tremendous, and we're coming more and more to realize that. We know that it's incredibly inefficient to move a average 150-pound person in a 2,000-pound vehicle. We can only do that through the massive use of fossil fuels, through petroleum, to do that. And so we know that, for example, in terms of our carbon emissions and trying to deal with climate change, transportation is our number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. It used to be buildings, but we've made some progress on buildings. We haven't made much progress on the transportation side of things. The other thing is the space devoted to the automobile. And when you look at a city, look at a community, and you see how much space is devoted to the automobile. When you go to a typical suburban shopping center, the parking lot's 3 times bigger than the building. You have to look at all the roadways that service these areas and stuff. And all those impervious surfaces, they generate stormwater runoff. They contribute to what's called the urban heat island. They take up space that could be utilized by nature. And I always, I'm fond of saying that people are our greatest resource, right? The ingenuity, the creativity, what human beings do, and the human spirit is amazing. But land is our greatest physical resource, and societies that use land poorly will perish. And we have been using it very poorly in this nation for the last 70 years, building everything around cars. So that led me to conclude with the research and observing our community that system of driving around by ourselves, which is largely what we do here, is creating probably more negative environmental impacts than anything else in our community.
If you're just joining with us this afternoon, we're talking to Christian Wagley of the nonprofit group Healthy Golf. He was one of the mayor's transition team members, and his pillar, as they say, was the environment. So, Christian, you did a lot of public outreach, and you talked to a lot of people in meetings and civil servants and business leaders about this issue. What did you learn? What were the primary takeaways from your public outreach?
Yeah, we had meetings out in the community. I met with staff members. I met with people from different environmental and community organizations. And there were really 3 main areas in terms of public input that I received the greatest amount of input on. One was support for more trees and stronger tree protection. The other one was the public very strongly supported and wants to see action on climate change and transitioning to renewable energy for the city, which for us here would mainly be solar energy. And then the third thing would be a more walkable and more bikeable community. I received very strong input on that. There's a lot of people that recognize the environmental impacts, again, of our transportation system and the need to transition to a system that's less dependent on us driving around by ourselves in cars and looking to alternatives.
What could you point out some positive examples of those 3 things, perhaps within the city? You mentioned that the buildings themselves have gotten more energy efficient. Any specifics you want to talk about?
Well, the city has taken some baby steps toward, well, in some cases more modest steps, but toward making the city more walkable, more bikeable. A quick, very tangible example and very historic example for our community was back in, I guess it'd be maybe 2011, 2012 now, the road diet along Main Street. So you had Main Street where the Maritime Park is, the baseball stadium. They realized as they started building that oh my goodness, we're going to have to get thousands of people across this street safely to the park, to a ball game, and right now cars are going 50 miles an hour. We need to do something here. And they did the first road diet in all of Northwest Florida. And the road diet meaning it went from 4 lanes down to 2 lanes, and this is a tremendous paradigm shift in our nation. I mean, I think like most of you, if I've gone to these transportation meetings for 20, 25 years, and the solution was always to add more lanes. And now we're actually seeing it where we can take lanes away and get a better community by doing that, make it more walkable, make it more bikeable. And guess what? The traffic still moves. They just don't move at 50 miles an hour. They move at 30 miles an hour, which is how they're supposed to be moving through the city. That was a good example there of a good historic step for the city to take in starting to rein in that car-dependent kind of transportation system and make it look at what we call multimodal, right? The streets are for more than just cars. They're for people. They're for bicyclists. They're for the disabled. All of those. So that's a good good example of something that has been done.
And when it comes to trees, you say more people the people you talk to are interested in trees, and one of your recommendations was to increase the amount of street tree plantings. Talk about that. I assuming that's the public property, the right-of-ways.
That's right, and there's very strong support for tree protection. Trees are a very emotional thing. People identify very emotionally with trees, and so there's a bit of a dilemma here, and that is that it's the city, and we have designated a lot of these properties, commercial properties, for more intensive development. It can be very difficult in sympathy to builders and contractors to preserve, as many trees as we'd like to see preserved. So the city has a great system in place for transferring some of that tree canopy from private property to public property. There's tree trust funds, for example, where mitigation fees are paid and those trees can be planted on public property. And the great thing about planting trees on public property is that the public now owns them. We can maintain them properly. We make sure that they're protected in perpetuity. When those trees are planted on private property, it's really hard to ever keep track of them. You lose track of them. And with street trees in particular, I felt very strongly that I wanted to promote those because in terms of synergy, you want to get as much out of your investments as possible. And so when you plant trees in that planting strip between the street and the sidewalk, the benefits there are tremendous. A lot of the tree canopy hangs out over the sidewalk and over the street, and it intercepts rainfall and keeps it from becoming stormwater runoff. You also can shade the pedestrian or the cyclist. It makes it more pleasant. I mean, you can put a sidewalk out here, and in this climate, if it doesn't have shade, people are never really gonna use it. And then the other thing is, we know that, in fact, the police chief says the #1 complaint to the city police department is cars going too fast. One of the ways to help to slow cars down is by planting trees along a street. It narrows the driver's field of view, and it does slow people down. So you look at street trees and how they promote a more walkable, bikeable future, a city that has transportation choices, intercepting stormwater, shade, cooling the city. I think they're the best trees and the best location that we can ever plant. I'd love to see us plant more of them.
In your research, talking to staff and looking at the existing laws, does the City of Pensacola have a plan to deploy the tree fund? I mean, is there a master plan of how they're going to use this money?
There's not a master plan necessarily. It is controlled by the council. Most of the trees in the past have been planted in city parks. That's just kind of easy. There's big open space. It doesn't require a lot of attention to detail. And I guess each year the mayor would submit where those trees would go, again, mainly in city parks, and council would approve that. Right now there's a hold on those funds. The council has a hold on those funds. They're going to have to unleash those funds and come to some agreement on how they want those trees to be used in the future. There is a requirement in the tree fund that trees be planted generally back in the area from which the trees were cut. So there is that stipulation. There are other sources of funding for trees as well. Local option sales tax or CRA funds could be used, for example, for street trees as well. But there is not a larger overall master plan, and the city has done very few street trees despite their benefits, and I think we'd really benefit by seeing more of them.
We're talking this afternoon with Christian Wagley of the Mayor's Transition Team, the environmental report that he researched and authored and submitted to the mayor as part of their effort. If you have any comments or questions for Christian regarding his participation in the team, or any other question you may be interested in, please put a comment on your Facebook page and we'll try to get them over to him right away. Christian, you also talked about people are concerned about climate change, and that the local government needs to address this issue. Are we doing enough, in your opinion, to deal with the current level of climate change, and also what the future may bring us?
Well, the city really hasn't done anything yet specifically for climate change. Now, the council has, they issued, or they created a task force that met for a year, and really timing is great on this. They issued their report to council in November, a series of recommendations, and I also used those recommendations to help inform my recommendations. And so the initial steps have been taken. I would say that our community, Pensacola, is somewhat of a leader in this area. We're the only community for many miles around that's even looked at the issue at all, but we really haven't started to act yet. And my two recommendations, one was to create a greenhouse gas inventory. This is fairly simple to do. The city would look at all the energy it uses for vehicles and buildings and then do a calculation from that, and that would give us a baseline of how much carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions we have right now. And that way we would know kind of where to focus our efforts on reducing energy use and transitioning to clean energy. You got to have that baseline to start with. And other communities, so many of them are doing this. And then the second thing is to go ahead and set a strong renewable energy goal for Pensacola. Many people have probably seen in the news, mayors all over the country, there's over 100 so far, have stepped forward and declared a renewable energy goal for their city. Now, this would be for city operations, not necessarily for everybody at home, but the city, by providing leadership on this, is inevitably going to help the community at large transition as well. And so there's a few small communities in America that have already transitioned to 100% renewable energy. In Florida, there are 7 cities that have that goal. Anywhere from 2030 to 2050 to attain that goal. And the city's climate task force recommended 30% renewable energy for Pensacola by 2030 and 100% by 2040, so kind of a mid-range scenario. And so it would be a combination of adding solar to city buildings and tapping into, say, the solar fields we're seeing around the area that were put in by the military, and then Gulf Power has tapped into those now, and Gulf Power has been bought by NextEra Energy. And then there also would be some power purchased from other communities. So as an example, Gulf Power, which is now NextEra, about 11% of our electricity that's running in this room right now comes from renewable sources, and the majority of that is wind energy purchased from Oklahoma. So there's also the ability to purchase clean energy from other places in the country and distribute that around. But the transition to renewable energy is already underway. There's absolutely no stopping it. The only question is how soon we get there, and we need to accelerate that transition.
You, when you presented your report, you did it as part of a group effort. Have you talked to the mayor one-on-one about your report?
Not yet. I've requested an appointment. I think it's one thing to put something in writing, but it's always better to sit down and actually talk something through and explain it. So I hope to get in to see him very soon and explain it fully, and certainly offer my continued support to the mayor and the community and the council and everybody to try to take these things forward.
If and when you do have that opportunity, Christian, to sit down with the mayor one-on-one, what would you recommend to him in terms of quick wins when it comes to climate change and renewable energy?
Well, one of the things I put in the appendix of the report is I had a proposal made for, there's a series of city buildings, a public works complex up Palafox Street, North Palafox there. There are very large metal warehouse buildings with flat roofs. This is classic place where other communities are putting solar panels on top. So I had the assessment done. I included that in my packet. Anybody can go online and look at it, and it's shown as a little over $1 million solar project with I think it's an 11-year payback on that. And basically after the initial installation, the power is basically free, and these systems last for 25 years. So they can look at whether they want to lease it, whether they want to purchase it outright, what makes the most sense. But that's somewhat of a quick win, I think, in terms of it'd be visible, it'd be tangible, it'd be a great step forward for the city to start making some of their own renewable energy. And that's the obvious place to do it, is on those flat roof buildings. And this is tried and true. It's going on all over America already.
And when you look at quick wins as far as public policy, you think of these large I'm talking about the solar for just here. You look at large buildings. I mean, the natural place you would go, a large roof structure. And you look at some place like a Cordova Mall, for example, which has a massive amount of roof space. Would you expect the owners of properties like that to invest on their own, or would a local government provide some sort of tax relief to incentivize property owners to switch to renewables. Do you think that's in the realm of possibility?
There are some local governments that have done that around the country. It's typically done at the state level and at the federal level. So we do have tax credits now at the federal level. If you want to install solar, there's some federal tax credit benefits for doing that are pretty generous, that have helped to move that along. The state of Florida, unfortunately, has not helped that transition much at all. We're one of the states that's very much behind. New Jersey has more installed solar energy than Florida. It doesn't make any sense. We get far more sun, but the state of Florida has not incentivized solar. They have not encouraged its use. They haven't set goals for it, and really it's been a way they've done it to protect the investor-owned utilities in Florida from competition, because when you make solar energy at home, that's less energy you buy off the grid, and they've done that to actually protect the monopolies of the utilities. So, I did not include a recommendation that the city necessarily incentivize it. I think increasingly the market, where it's taking us, is the cost of fossil fuel energy is tending to go up over time, whereas the cost of renewables, in our case solar mainly, continues to go down over time, and those things are pretty much just about meeting here now.
You, the subject of recyclables, I just noticed something. In fact, I posted it on one of the Facebook pages here recently, that the global market for recycled materials has collapsed, or appears to be collapsing, causing a lot of the companies that collect recycled material for resale to back away from the market or not pay as much, and that some municipalities in the country right now are finding themselves with large bills to dispose of recyclables, and that this may cause them, the cost benefit of running a recycling program is starting to narrow, and that there's a possibility some cities have abandoned recycling recently for that. So the thing came up. I remember my military years out in Hawaii Island State. Recycle's a big issue, not much landfill. So they built many years ago a waste to energy incinerator. And I checked on that here just yesterday, and it's still in operation and still producing a positive cash flow and meeting all the permitted environmental requirements. And I was wondering, what does the future for Pensacola and Escambia County look like from your point of view for the recycling programs?
Well, I did speak to the city's solid waste director, and he didn't yet, at least as of yet, indicate major issues with their finding a place to put the recyclables and people taking them. They had a lot of issues with contamination, people putting stuff in there that's not supposed to be in there. They were going to be doing education on that. But you're right, certainly this issue of the world market has become more and more to the fore. And it is true, incineration to create energy is used in other places, and you look at a place like Sweden, which is far ahead of the United States on really every environmental issue, and that is how they actually dispose of most of their waste is done that way. And so I have not dug into the details of that specifically. There's always been concern about the air emissions. When you burn something, you get air emissions, and so making sure that those are those issues are accounted for. I'm not up on the latest science. I know there's been some proposals locally for something that's more of like a plasma base. I think it's super high temperatures, and the process would be a little different than normal burning, and that was an environmentally friendlier way to do it. I know some folks have proposed that here locally. The landfill, I think at the last I checked, had something like 40 years or something of life left in it. The reality is that I didn't get a lot of feedback about waste issues, and interestingly, when the scientists analyze our daily lives, what we throw away is actually one of the smaller parts of it. It really is much less of an issue compared to the energy we use in driving around, the energy we use in heating and cooling and lighting our buildings, and what we eat, actually, interestingly. Our diets are a huge part of that. What we throw away is a very small part of it, but it's much more visible and tangible to us because we see it and we touch it and we feel it, and so we get more emotional and interested in those issues. But compared to the other stuff, it's actually much smaller, but it's clearly an issue we're going to have to deal with, and I would expect to see some more people probably come forward with maybe some proposals for incineration. So,
Christian, as we wind down today's program, I want to move over to water quality, groundwater. I think the drinking water is a part of that equation. I know the city gets its drinking water from ECUA, so But at least from the city's point of view and your transition efforts, what are the big takeaways when it comes to water quality?
So my focus would have been where the city's purview is, which is on surface water quality, and I would say that the city of Pensacola has a pretty good program for what we would call stormwater retrofit. So we've had, back in the day, streets were always directed to drain water through pipes or directly down into our bodies of water, and that caused a lot of pollution in places like Bayou Chico, Bayou Tahar. To its credit, the city council, almost 20 years ago now, started a stormwater utility. Every city property owner pays a small amount on their property each year to fund these projects. The city started funding or doing those mainly around Bayou Tahar, treatment vaults that catch the worst of the stuff beneath the streets. It has improved Bayou Tahar anecdotally, and people I know from paddling my kayak on it and talking to people. The water's clear, the water's cleaner. We're seeing some comeback and recovery there. So the city should definitely be applauded for that. We continue to have problems with bacterial contamination following heavy rainfall events in all of our city waterways, and that's a direct threat to human health and human contact to the water. That continues, and that's a real negative that needs to be addressed. Drinking water is totally ECUA's thing. I did get some input on that. I do address that in the appendix section of my report. There are some things maybe to be concerned about there, but they need further research, and people really need to direct that to ECUA. But for surface waters, there's definitely some improvement going on and room for more. The city's going to be shifting their stormwater program from water quality to more water quantity now, dealing with flooding. So there's a long-term shift going on with that.
Christian, thank you. We're out of time this afternoon, but I could just go on and on with you. A lot of interesting topics to go over here. But I know the mayor has thanked you, and I think many of the citizens thank you and all the transition team members for it took a lot of time and their volunteers to do the research and do the reports, and yours was particularly noteworthy, at least from our point of view. So many of you know Christian. You can contact him through Facebook or other means. I'm sure he's always interested to the outreach part, to talk to you and answer questions. So Christian, thank you once again. And what's in your future here? What are you going to be doing next? What's next on your plate?
What's next? Wow. I've got a lot of events going on for my work. I've got some film festival coming up, an event out on the beach, Earth Day, things like that, where we're going to be out in the community while the weather's good, in the spring, engaging people and getting them to work on especially issues with the legislature. So the legislature's in session right now till early May, and we're trying to get some things dealt with in terms of some of the algae issues we had in Florida last year and water pollution and such like that. And then continuing my work on a lot of advocacy for making our city safer and better for walking and bicycling, again, being probably the biggest environmental issue we face, but also public health-wise when you look at things like obesity and people unfortunately being struck and killed by vehicles and all those things that tie together with creating a better city that's based more on people and less on cars going too fast. So I'll continue to work on that.
Well, thank you. And from all of our viewers at ECW and ECW Live, we thank you and hope to talk to you again. A lot to talk about there. The legislature's in session. Yes, indeed. And the governor has made the water issues in Florida a high priority. And let's hope that all of that is followed through and the legislature can support him on that. And we learn more about how that's affecting us up here in Northwest Florida. So, Christian, thank you once again. And to all of you, thanks for joining with us. Teresa Hill, our producer back here behind the cameras, pushing all the buttons. It's spring break time, so we'll be back on ECW Live once here spring break gets all under and behind us. So thank you once again. Please take good care, friends.